But see, the Dutch government, the Dutch people, Europe, you have no regard for Ukrainian life. They're not humans to you. They're just numbers. And you want more numbers. You want to throw them out. More numbers, more numbers. These are dead men in the ground, dead, lost their arms, lost their eyes, lost their bodies are broken. These are wives, these are mothers, these are daughters, these are sons who have lost their parents. They are kicked out of their homes. They're around Europe with no home to go home to. No, you don't care about the Ukrainians, and yet you continue to claim that you do. It's sort of disgusting in my book.
Hey, thanks a lot, Scott. Good to have you here. I'm following you since the days of you being the UN weapons inspector. And later on in my 2008 book, I have you on 14 pages. You go way back, but you're still here. Let's dig right in with your old friend Seymour Hersh, recently writing about, let's say, sort of a division between the intelligence agencies about how to view the current situation in Ukraine. What do you think the view is in, the different views are in, let's say, NATO and United States? And what is your assessment of the situation?
Well, again, let me point out that Seymour Hersh and I have been friends for a quarter of a century. I have a lot of regard for him, the highest regard for him as a journalist, a man of extreme integrity with a proven track record of reporting. So if he writes something, you have to take it seriously. But like any journalist, you're a prisoner of your source. And so any criticism I'm about ready to make isn't about Seymour Hersh, but about his source. I can agree with the conclusion that his source reached about Ukraine has lost this war. I think that's apparent to everybody. But, you know, you have to look at how this source reached this assessment. And when this source talks about Russia, talks about the Russian leadership, it's very sophomoric. He speaks of Putin as being a thug. He talks about the unjustified invasion of Ukraine, all on, And when I see that, I realize this source doesn't know anything about Russia, doesn't know anything about the situation, is operating on the, paper thin foundation of fact, which means that while his assessment today might be correct, well, a broken clock is correct twice a day, but the rest of the time it's just wrong. And I think that moving forward, it's wrong. For instance, this is somebody who believes that this could be a frozen conflict, somebody who believes that this is a, that the Ukrainians, have a chance for a negotiated settlement, that if NATO just provides the right equipment, some sort of outcome other than total Russian victory can be achieved. And this is fundamentally wrong. If you don't respect Vladimir Putin, that means you don't study Vladimir Putin. And if you don't study Vladimir Putin, then you don't know what Vladimir Putin's thinking. And if you don't know what he's thinking, then you're missing over 50% of the equation, because you can't have a frozen conflict unless both sides want the conflict to freeze. And Putin and the Russian leadership will not allow a frozen conflict. They're winning. They're going to win. And they're going to keep pushing forward, regardless of what Ukraine and NATO want. They don't, frankly speaking, we're at the point in the war where Russia just doesn't care about anything NATO says, does, thinks, wants. The same about Ukraine. The only thing, there was a time for that. If we remember, Russia, again, this shows the ignorance of the source that Seymour Hersh is relying upon. Russia didn't launch an unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine to seize territory, etc. They launched a limited special military operation to get Ukraine to the negotiating table to accomplish, after the fact of conflict, what Russia always wanted to accomplish for the conflict, and that is a peace settlement that has Ukraine staying neutral, never joining NATO. Jan Stoltenberg has admitted this. He gave a presentation earlier this month where he said, yeah, the Russians said we could have stopped this war, but all we had to do is not allow Ukraine to join it. We're not going to do that. It's an open door policy. He admits that this war is about NATO trying to get Ukraine to join it. And so Russia will not agree to any set of circumstances that has the potential of Ukraine joining NATO. In order to achieve that, it must defeat Ukraine, which it's doing. And because NATO has used Ukraine as a proxy for a larger war between the collective West and Russia, it will defeat NATO. This is the reality. Seymour Hersh's source doesn't seem to accept that reality, and that's why I have to take anything his source says with a heavy grain of salt.
Let's then move on to a different source, Jeffrey Sachs, recently saying that the negotiations right when the war started between Ukraine and Russia were, let's say, broken up. And he says, well, the reason was not so much they wanted a proxy war, they wanted to look tough on China. What do you think about that?
I couldn't think of a more absurd thing to say. Again, to look tough on. How are you looking tough on China? I'd ask Mr. Sachs that. How does this look tough on China? Nothing that happens in Europe looks tough for China. China worries about the Pacific. China is not a party to this conflict. China's not providing Russia with weaponry. All China's doing is engaged in continued economic, interaction with Russia. They're not buying into the sanctions. But the idea that somehow anything the West does in Russia looks tough on China. The Taiwanese conflict is completely separate from what's going on in Europe. Even if there was no war in Europe, the Taiwanese conflict has its own parameters. It has its own four corners of reality that it has to deal with. Jeffrey Sachs is hopping around the globe as if, China's sitting there going, oh my God, what's happening in Ukraine affects us. China doesn't care because China only has one objective, to reunify Taiwan with China. That's it, a one China policy. Nothing's going to change that. This is of existential importance. So you're not going to intimidate China away from the one thing that matters most to them by anything that goes on in Ukraine. Again, I respect Jeffrey Sachs, but he's just dead wrong on this, dead wrong.
Scott, could you perhaps summarize for us, let's say, a few key points in history leading up to the Ukraine war? Let's say 1990, you have this not an inch. There's 1992, there's 2008, there's 2014, of course. There's also the end of 2021 with Putin saying Ukraine not in NATO. Negotiations in March of 2022. Could you make a summation of this leading up to the war?
Well, sure. I'll even go back further to 1945 when, we can even go back further, 1939. We can go back further, 1936. What I'm trying to say is we're dealing with a Ukrainian reality that the world seems to be ignoring. The Ukrainian government today is heavily influenced by the ideology of Stepan Bandera. So we have to go back to 1936 when Stepan Bandera was on trial in Poland for the murder of a Polish prosecutor. And in that trial, he said, he was asked the question, how important is Ukrainian nationalism to you? And he said, I'd be willing to kill 1 million innocent people if it meant I could get a Ukraine. Okay, so the mindset is set. He began openly collaborating with Nazi Germany. In 1939, his Banderist units carried out the rape of Lvov, murdering Jews by the thousands. There's photographs that are horrible, but I encourage everybody to look at them because that's the reality of the Banderist ideology. It turns human beings into animals. 1941, 1943, 44, the Volyn massacre, the Banderas slaughtering 110,000 Poles because they're subhuman, because Polish blood cannot be allowed to intermix with pure Western Ukrainian blood because the Western Ukrainians are a pure race, a super race. Again, Western Ukrainian mentality. 1945, the defeat of Nazi Germany. Many Banderas fled, including Stepan Bandera, fled to Germany, along with General Gehlen, the head of the Gehlen organization, the German intelligence in the Eastern Front, which was working with tens of thousands of Banderas who stayed behind as sort of intelligence and sabotage units. The Organization of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, gets a hold of Gehlen, says, oh my God, you can do this in Western Ukraine? You work for us now. So literally the United States took under its wing a Nazi organization, cleansed it to keep doing the job of what? Disrupting the Soviets in Eastern Poland and Western Ukraine. And this went on from 1945 to 1953, 54, when they were defeated, but the CIA continued to fund the Western Ukrainians in diaspora, in Canada, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, to continue the connectivity in Ukraine. For what purpose? To bring down the Soviet Union. And the reason why I bring that up is you bring up, 1990. The growth of modern Ukrainian nationalism in the final stages of perestroika. Who are the people promoting Ukrainian nationalism? Banderists, the children of Banderists, people who were arrested by the Soviets in 1953, sent to the Gulag, where they should have been executed or put away forever for the crimes they committed. But instead, in 1956, Nikita Khrushchev opens the gates of the Gulag because he said Stalin was an evil man. Everybody in there is a political prisoner. He let them free. They returned to Ukraine. They insinuate themselves into Ukrainian society with the aid and abetting of the Ukrainian diaspora, receiving money from the CIA. The CIA continued to fund the Banderists in Ukraine up until 1990. After 1990, the funds came in through other directions. But my point is, it's been the goal of the United States to use Ukraine as a vehicle to bring down Soviet power and later Russian power to prevent the Russians from rising up. 1991, we had the collapse of the Soviet Union. 1992, we begin this process of, again, the fiction. I think it was 1994 where you have the agreement, the Bucharest Memorandum, and Ukraine is promulgating the lie that we gave up our nuclear weapons for security guarantees. Let me just educate everybody. Ukraine never had nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. When the Soviet Union collapsed, nuclear weapons were on the soil of Ukraine, but the Ukrainian government never had control of these weapons. In fact, the Russians told the Ukrainians, if you try to gain control of them, we will annihilate you and take you off the face of the planet because you will never be allowed to have nuclear weapons. That was the reality. It should have been given up. The Ukrainians then carried out extortion. They basically said, we won't agree to this memorandum unless you pay off our debt and give us more money. Nobody talks about that, how the Ukrainians were bribed into this. Ukrainians treated as if we gave up nuclear weapons for security guarantees. No, you blackmailed, cajoled, extorted the West to give you billions of dollars, and then you signed this agreement. And now today they're trying to hide behind this agreement. 2000 and let's go to 2005. I think it's an important thing in there. President Putin gives a speech before the Russian Federation Federal Council, sort of the Senate of the Russian parliamentary system. This speech has been misquoted. You might be familiar with the concept of Putin saying that the greatest tragedy of the last century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And everybody's saying, oh, that's proof that Putin wants the Soviet Union to come back. No, you got to listen to the whole thing. One, he didn't say the greatest. He said one of the greatest tragedies of the last century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Why? Because overnight, tens of millions of Russians became homeless. That's the reason why. Not that he wants the Soviet Union back, but overnight, tens of millions of Russians became homeless. And he said, I am the president of the Russian nation. Not just the Russian Federation, but the Russian nation. And the Russian nation is defined by the people that live within the borders of the Russian Federation and the tens of millions of people who live outside the borders, who at one time looked to Moscow for leadership, but now they are homeless entities in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, nations that don't want them there, nations that are openly hostile to them. He said, I have to protect them. This is important. The world tends to forget that, but it's an important thing because in 2008, we have the United States. William Burns was the U.S. ambassador to Russia in 2008. And he wrote a memorandum in early 2008, said, "Niet means niet." That's the policy of the Russians. No means no. He said, it's a red line. If we invite Ukraine into NATO, it will set in motion events that will eventually lead to the inevitable military intervention by Russia into Ukraine, because Russia will never allow Ukraine to join NATO.
But now the same man is the CIA director.
He is the CIA director, correct. But in 2008, he wrote that memorandum. And what happened? In late 2008, they invited Ukraine to join NATO, which tells you that this was a cause-effect relationship. This isn't, as Jan Stoltenberg said, simply a matter of Ukraine wants to join, we're going to open our doors and invite them in. They knew in advance that by inviting Ukraine into NATO, that this would lead to an inevitable military conflict with Russia, because that was always the objective, dating back to 1945, using Ukraine as a tool to weaken Russia, to tear apart Russia, and that's what happened in 2008. In 2014, the CIA, again, the reason why I brought up the Banderists is we have the Maidan events. Now, they call it a revolution, they call it, freedom. Maidan was a peaceful demonstration against Viktor Yanukovych, the Ukrainian president, who had made a decision that he couldn't afford to pivot to the European Union, that he had to stay connected to Russia economically. And so there was protests in the streets saying, you betrayed us. You said you were going to deliver. You didn't deliver. But these are peaceful protests. They begin in December of 2013, January 2013, peaceful protests. February 2014, violent protests. What happened? The Nazis came in, the right sector, Sloboda Party, the Banderists. They went to Lvov, broke open a police station, took the weapons, brought the weapons to Kiev, and began killing people, shooting people, promulgating violence. It led to the violent overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych's government. It was a coup d'etat, backed by whom? Well, we now know the CIA was backing this, because the CIA has always had connectivity to the Banderists in Ukraine dating back to 1945. And so it's a CIA-driven coup, kicks out the constitutionally elected government of Viktor Yanukovych, puts in place these nationalists, and we know that the United States was aware of who we were getting. We had the intercepted phone call of Victoria Nuland saying, my boy Yats is going to be the prime minister. And she said, and some guy said, well, Yats is close with this other dude who's a Nazi. She said, that's okay. We're good with that.
Scott, is it true that by now the CIA is less positive about where the war is going compared to, let's say, the Defense Intelligence Agency? Or?
Well, I think the CIA is recognizing that the war has backfired. I think the CIA was very enthusiastic about this war when it began. The Zelensky Project was a project designed to create this conflict, and they got the conflict. And I think the CIA, the DIA, and everybody else believed that the Russians would fail economically through economic sanctions, militarily on the battlefield. The fact is, Russia's become stronger because of this conflict. So I think the CIA today is realizing that this war has backfired, that this whole Ukraine gambit has not gone the way they want it. There's no doubt about that. The DIA, look, the DIA is often detached from reality because there's money attached to their assessments. The DIA's assessments are used to justify military expenditures. I know this because back when I was a weapons inspector in the Soviet Union, I had the audacity to write a report based upon my firsthand observations at the Soviet missile factory about missile production rates. And I said the most missiles they can produce per month is X. And the X meant that the DIA's assessment of the Russians having a covert force of hundreds of missiles that were produced in secret couldn't be true because the production rate couldn't match that. And I was called into the carpet by a DIA brigadier general and all of his colonels telling me to change my assessment because billions of dollars were attached to it. Not because it was wrong, but because it was inconvenient for their budget. The DIA's assessments have to be seen through that light. Their assessments are used to justify military budgets. The CIA, they have politically manipulated their assessments, but they do have the ability, when confronted with failure, to say, we were wrong. Look at Iraq. The CIA said WMD, WMD, WME, WMD. All of a sudden they said, well, there's no WMD. We got it wrong. Right now they're saying, help Ukraine. Ukraine can defeat Russia. Help Ukraine. And Ukraine's losing the war. They can't defeat Russia. The CIA is in the process of admitting they were wrong, and now they're going to try and come up with a solution. The DIA can't do that because the second they say they're wrong, that means that the threat model that was being used to justify defense expenditures is no longer accurate, and that money will be used elsewhere. So the DIA, you have to treat all of their assessments with heavy suspicion.
Scott, I understand you think the war is a lost cause. How do you think they're going to spin the coming defeat?
Well, I mean, it is a lost cause, first of all. It's not, I think it's a lost cause. 400,000 dead Ukrainians can never be considered a victory under any circumstances. A counteroffensive that has been funded with tens of billions of dollars from the United States and Europe that was designed to create 12 brigades whose job it was to punch through Robotyno village, reach the town of Tokmak, and seize Melitopol by August, September, hasn't gotten past Robotyno. The Ukrainian vehicles are being destroyed. The Ukrainian soldiers are killed. The Russians are just getting stronger. So it's not that I think that this is a lost cause. It is a lost cause, and nobody can articulate anything counter to that. So it's done. They've lost. How is the West going to spin this? Well, first of all, the West continues to be delusional. I mean, look at the Dutch. I mean, are you still seriously going to continue to provide Leopard tanks? Are you still seriously going to provide F-16 fighters? For what? For what purpose? I mean, are the Dutch going to be honest that every F-16 fighter they provide to the Ukrainians is an old fighter that has outlived its operational usefulness? Are they going to be that honest? Are the Dutch going to provide the Ukrainians with the maintenance records of these aircraft so they know that there's stress fractures, that these aircraft have flown beyond their life expectancy? Are they going to be that honest? No, they're not. The Dutch aren't being honest. No one's being honest. The only honest ones, I think, were the Danes. The Danes came out and said, yeah, these are, oh no, the Belgians, I'm sorry. The Belgians said, yeah, these are broken airplanes. We're not going to give them to you. At last, somebody was honest. These planes won't work. If you put a Ukrainian pilot in these planes and ask him to fly combat missions against the Russians, he's going to die. Do the Dutch know that you're killing Ukrainian pilots? Because that's what you're doing. And when you give them the bad Dutch Leopard tanks, all you're doing is killing Ukrainian soldiers. Every piece of equipment you gave the Ukrainians was garbage, and you know it. You know it. You're not being honest. You wouldn't go to war in that equipment. That's why you pulled it off and put it in a warehouse. And now you're taking it out of the warehouse, putting a fresh coat of paint on it, sending it to Ukraine so that the Ukrainians can die. Come on. That's not honesty. You're going to spin it, but that's what the Dutch do. That's what NATO does. You spin this. So the thing that you're going to do is convince yourself that we did everything possible to help the Ukrainians win. It's not our fault. It's your fault. 100% your fault. They never had a chance because you gave them crap equipment, you gave them bad training, and you allowed them to go to war thinking they could win when you know they couldn't. Would the Dutch send a soldier to carry out a complicated breaching operation of a fortified position who only had 21 days of basic training? No. Would a Dutch officer allow a Dutch unit to engage in this that didn't have a year and a half, 2 years of complex training in combined arms warfare? No, but you let the Ukrainians do this with 3 to 5 weeks. The Dutch are responsible. NATO is responsible, but they're going to spin it by saying it's Ukraine's fault. Look at the cowardly NATO. They said after the Ukrainians suffered 71,000 casualties in the first couple months of this, they said it's the Ukraine's fault. They're casualty averse. Would the Dutch government say losing 71,000 Dutch soldiers was casualty averse? Or would you say, what the hell are we doing losing that many people? But see, the Dutch government, the Dutch people, Europe, you have no regard for Ukrainian life. They're not humans to you. They're just numbers. And you want more numbers. You want to throw them out. More numbers, more numbers. These are dead men in the ground, dead, lost their arms, lost their eyes, lost their bodies are broken. These are wives, these are mothers, these are daughters, these are sons who have lost their parents. They are kicked out of their homes. They're around Europe with no home to go home to. No, you don't care about the Ukrainians, and yet you continue to claim that you do. It's sort of disgusting in my book.
And the next thing, what will happen, do you think, is sort of a pivot to Asia? We go to China and wage war over there?
NATO? NATO can't wage war anywhere. NATO has no combat capability. I challenge the Dutch to put a combat capable brigade on the ground right now. Right now. Gone to war, guys. Get a brigade out of your barracks on the ground. A brigade that's capable of sustaining combat for 2 weeks. Can't do it. NATO can't do it. Nobody can do it. And you want to go pivot to China? Really?
Yeah, you may laugh about it. What do you think the situation is in Washington, in New York, in Brussels?
Look, hot air is free. It's cheap. So NATO can talk all at once. Hot air is cheap. Let's see you do something. And you can't. So all you're going to do, what's happening now is NATO, the Dutch, the Americans, they're just talking to themselves, making themselves feel good. They're coming up with things, PowerPoint presentations. I can make any PowerPoint presentation I want. I can put in photographs. I can draw arrows on maps. That doesn't make it reality. Reality is actually doing something. What can NATO do? Literally, I'm asking, what can NATO do? And the answer is nothing. Literally nothing. Is there a giant NATO Navy ready to deploy to the Pacific Ocean to challenge the Chinese? Nope. Does NATO have a dozen parachute divisions that can deploy right now on NATO aircraft and reinforce Taiwan? Nope. NATO's got nothing. Got hot air, and that's all that's happening. It's hot air made to make people feel good about the impending defeat, not just in Europe, but in the Pacific. Look, Lieutenant General Clinton Hinote was the Deputy Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. He recently retired. But before he retired, he briefed the Pentagon and he briefed the White House on the results of 3 years of war games run by the Pentagon about conflict with China. These are realistic war games. These aren't the fake war games done by think tanks and stuff that are where the data is manipulated to get an outcome that people want. These are the real war games run by the guys who are going to fight the war. And what he reported back was, we lose every time. There's not a single scenario that we run where America defeats China. Every time we lose. So he said, we need to be careful about the policy direction you're getting us on, because every policy direction leads to the potential of conflict. And once we enter into conflict with China, it's a preordained outcome that we lose. This is the honest assessment of the man responsible for that. Has that been shared with NATO? Do the Dutch people know that America can't win a war against China? Can't. Impossible.
Last question, Scott. If if it's possible, can you make a prediction? When do you think this war in Ukraine is going to end?
This is the prediction that always gets you in trouble. You see.
Yeah.
I'm not on the Russian general staff. I don't have access to.
What is your feeling?
But let's break it down this way. This war will only end with a political resolution to the problem. But to get to a political resolution, the Ukrainian army needs to be militarily defeated. That defeat is ongoing as we speak. The question is, when will the Ukrainian army collapse? And in order to know that, I have to know how much pressure the Russians are willing to put on the Ukrainians. Every time you put pressure on the Ukrainians, that results in dead Russian soldiers. And the Russian government, knowing that they've won this thing, knowing that they haven't put an artificial timeline on victory, is not going to needlessly sacrifice Russian soldiers. But they also aren't going to allow a situation to occur where you get a frozen conflict, a ceasefire, or a pause to the muddy season. I think the Russians are going to continue to put pressure on the Ukrainians along the totality of the line of conflict up until the moment the Ukrainian army collapses. I continue to believe that that moment could be sometime. I said, when people asked me this question back in May and June, I said, I think the collapse will take place between late summer, early fall. Well, we're done with late summer. We're into the early fall part, but we're heading in that direction. There's no more Ukrainian troops left. They've used their strategic reserves. They've burned through everything. They've got nothing left. The Russians have 200,000 reserves that they have yet to commit to this battle. And when they do, it'll be done to place pressure on the Ukrainians. I think you're going to see the Ukrainian line break and be forced to pull back to the Dnieper River. And when that happens, you're going to see political collapse and the Ukrainian government suing for peace, and that peace will come with unconditional terms, meaning that the Ukrainian government will have to accept whatever terms the Russians put forward.
Thanks a lot, Scott Ritter. Hope to talk to you soon.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.